I'm not giving up.
I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either gonna be okay.
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Imhotep. The most prominent archaeologist in Egypt is the French architect Jean-Philippe Lauer, whose more than 70-year career in Egyptology speaks for itself. In his 1988 autobiographical memoir, Saqqara, une vie, he recounts an anecdote in which he honors Cecil Firth, one of his English colleagues and friends. During the 1920s, Firth had been showing a notable visitor the attractions of Saqqara, one of Egypt's most popular tourist destinations. The Step Pyramid, the primary attraction of Saqqara, was the site of their tour. Firth told the woman that this monument was constructed approximately 2,800 years ago, making it the oldest and, in many ways, the most fascinating of all the pyramids. "I apologize," said the interested guest. "Which would it be, BC or AD?" "Well," the visitor replied, using every resource at hand, "it's hard to be certain because it was so long ago." Though these tales have some merit, archaeologists love to hear about visitors' occasionally shaky grasp of the cultures they have traveled great distances to observe. Even the most knowledgeable people can be taken aback by the scope of ancient Egyptian history. Classical sources suggest Cleopatra and Julius Caesar cruised down the Nile in 47 BC. As ardent travelers, Caesar and Cleopatra might have taken a detour to see the Step Pyramid west of Memphis, or perhaps they were enjoying the array of Greek and Egyptian restaurants on the Ptolemaic state barge. Since there are more years between Cleopatra and Djoser, the king for whom the Step Pyramid was constructed, than between Cleopatra and us, this is the equivalent of the day before yesterday, in terms of a pyramid lifetime. Caesar and Cleopatra claimed that Pharaoh Djoser was an ancient Egyptian. There's an alternative phrase for it. While there are no perfect standards for determining the beginning of history, one approach is to begin when a civilization develops a writing system. This criterion may seem elitist and irrelevant to the more rebarbative school of dirt diggers, not to mention the prehistory, but it will serve its purpose here since it is straightforward to measure. Writing dates back to approximately 3200 BC and was first practiced in Mesopotamia, or modern-day southern Iraq. Egypt emerged swiftly after, and new findings indicate that the ruling class used primitive writing systems by 3100, if not earlier. Based on this chronology, the emergence of Egyptian civilization began 52 centuries ago. Traditionally, the history of ancient Egypt is divided into 30 dynasties, with each dynasty spanning the beginning of pharaonic kingship until the arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BC. However, Ptolemy, the dynastic name of Alexander the Great's successors, and the succeeding Roman emperors also used the title pharaoh. Pharaohs continued to rule after the Roman capital was moved to Constantinople, and the decision was made to allow Christianity freedom of worship, as shown by hieroglyphic inscriptions erected by emperors such as Constantius II, AD 337 to 361. Despite being nominally Christian, these emperors in Egypt chose to worship a very pagan sacred animal. These texts date back to the middle of the 4th century AD. We can state that a pharaoh ruled over Egypt for 36 of the 52 centuries, which we can define as history, given the existence of an afterlife for Egyptian civilization. 36 out of 52 centuries is nearly 7/10 of the total amount of events that have been documented. and we casually refer to this as ancient Egypt. Writing in Egypt has been postponed due to the discovery of inscriptions on labels found in one of the oldest monumental tombs at the site of Abydos in Upper Egypt. This tomb may be the resting place of one of the chieftains who ruled over a large portion of the country's south before the formation of a united state, dating back 50 or 100 years before the first dynasty. In terms of writing, Mesopotamia may still be ahead of Egypt, but this Abydos discovery closes the gap to 1 or 2 generations. Therefore, the most likely explanation is that the Egyptians decided to create a similar system after learning or seeing that scribes in Mesopotamia were experimenting with pictures to record abstract words and concrete objects. All writing originates from adapting images to convey ideas that cannot be illustrated. Both Mesopotamian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics utilize pictorial symbols to represent phonetic concepts and elements. Otherwise, they are different. Hieroglyphs are new signs made especially for their own language, not translations of Mesopotamian signs to another language, which gives the impression of intentional creation. Although the exact origins of Egyptian writing remain unknown, we know who the authorities were that necessitated establishing such a system of records. This presents us with the most notable aspect of ancient Egypt. Unlike its neighbors, the Nile was a single state. While distinct nations are commonplace in the modern world, and we rarely consider them unusual, unified political systems were uncommon in the ancient world. The competitive nature of the city-states that once made up Mesopotamia gave rise to most of the region's technological inventiveness. Mesopotamia, also known as Sumer, Babylonia, or whatever term is used, was a complicated region to unite, and this complexity is reflected in the frequent name changes and the corresponding changes in political identity. Even today, Iraq shows significant regional differences, and if its current system of governance collapses, the country may become divided. The Hellenic world was a patchwork of warring states and shifting alliances for most of its history. While still having a highly complex social structure, ancient Egypt gave rise to the world's first unified monarchy. It did so a millennium before Mesopotamia, and this monarchy persisted until Alexander the Great's arrival, with a few periods of anarchy in between. Following this, Pharaonic Egypt was ruled by foreigners until Cleopatra passed away on August 12th, 30th BC. The Ptolemaic kingdom and Cleopatra's influence could be seen throughout the Roman Empire, which succeeded her. The pharaoh was the idea that might have given rise to this cohesive state and the individual who personified it. We come across an abstraction that seems far ahead of its time. The complete form of the intricate theology that defined the Egyptian king dates only to the 6th dynasty, which occurred several centuries after the Egyptian state's existence. According to this belief system, the king represented several gods, most notably Horus, the newborn son descended from its parent, who had passed away the night before. Like the sun god, Osiris ruled over the earth, died at the hands of evil and disruptive forces, and then returned to life as the light beneath the earth, ruler of the dead in the underworld, and judge of the living. Although the idea of the king as a god's representative was widespread in antiquity, the Egyptian king, also known as Pharaoh, stood out due to the dual nature of his most famous title. Written in the hieroglyphs for a sedge plant and a bee, this is the insibia, or more traditionally, the menu by title. Once these symbols are translated into Greek, the bilingual Rosetta Stone typically displays the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt. This, however, is limited to a secondary reading. The last portion of this title embodies the essence of the king's humanity, encapsulated in the name he was given at birth. Nisu, the first of the 2 names typically used for the king, expresses the person's divine nature. This praenomen is given to the king upon his accession, and he reiterates it at the coronation, almost invariably mentioning the sun gods, who established kingship on earth and in heaven. Cartouches are oval frames that enclose the divine praenomen and human nomen, making them stand out from the rest of the inscription. Following his coronation, the king was given the religious name throne name, which identified him as a manifestation of the sun god. The king's official name upon his death was Osiris the Nashuyu. The second name disappears when written in B hieroglyph. The king's dual nature on earth corresponded to the divine emanation within his portal, the human dimension. The latter would deteriorate with age and pass away. The former had eternal life. Pharaoh was truly a king of gods. Though theology was still in its infancy, this idea significantly impacted the Egyptian state. The king incorporated the recently established state. He embodied the dual nature of both the divine and human and Egypt's two primary geographical regions, the Nile Valley to the south and the Delta to the north. Subsequent tradition held that the south had militarily conquered the north to establish the Egyptian state. Though something akin to this may have happened, this idea has frequently been rejected, particularly in the iconoclastic days of new archaeology in the 1960s and 1970s. Conquests do occur. Given the ancient world's close relationship between religion and power, a phenomenon that continues into the modern era, the military domination of Upper Egypt may, in fact, have corresponded with philosophical reflections on the essence of kingship. Michael Rice claims that the pharaoh's function in ancient Egypt was similar to a Jungian archetype, signifying the uniqueness of a nation that had not yet come to terms with personal identity. Accepting this theory in its entirety is not necessary because it is difficult to refute the idea that the individual Egyptians of this era, buried by their relatives with opulent grave goods and exhibiting the same level of care and attention as their later descendants, had a deep awareness of their own existence. But it's crucial to remember that the king of this far-off time captured the spirit of what made Egypt special. He was the land's sacred embodiment, and one of his titles, usually rendered as Majesty, truly refers to his incarnation. Being dead was one of the unusual characteristics that set ancient Egyptians apart even at this early date. Other cultures have critiqued the Egyptian cult of the funerary for the majority of its history, emphasizing how unusual it is among the ancient world's religions. The Odyssey's titular hero, in Book Event, longs to call upon the departed Achilles, who has been resurrected via necromancy from the Homeric underworld. Odysseus finds it impossible to resist inquiring about his friend's life below the surface. In response, Achilles says he would sooner be the lowest hired worker on a meager earthly estate than the ruler of all the dead. The Old Testament makes very few references to an afterlife, and the Babylonian Hades was a similarly gloomy place. However, life with Osiris was a paradise for the deceased king, his allies, and those who rendered judgment in front of this magnificent deity. At this early point in Egyptian history, it is unclear who the king's associates were supposed to be, but it is not hard to imagine that someone who had worked in the god-king's eternal home would be allowed some part in his immortality. It is possible that individuals who were able to obtain a burial place near the deceased monarch's tomb were also granted a general share in the prosperity of the afterlife. Despite this seemingly ambiguous promise, the deceased's relatives, who interred them in their ever-expanding cemeteries on the edge of the deserts, probably thought they were going extinct.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Your team just added its 67th AI tool and also your 67th security blind spot. The good news? The Vanta agent works like a GRC engineer in the background, finding every app your team uses, scoring the risk, and drafting fixes for you. Vanta is the platform used by over 16,000 fast-moving companies like Ramp, Cursor, and Harvey, who are shaping the future with AI and staying ahead of AI risk. Get started at Vanta.com.
Our evidence contradicts the sometimes held belief that, during the early dynasties, only the pharaoh was immortal. Osiris would have been willing to spend eternity with more Egyptians, even though he did not have a complete guest list. At Abydos, the first dynasty, and some of the Second Dynasty's kings were buried in Upper Egypt. However, as time passed, an increasing amount of attention focused on the location of Saqqara, which is situated on a plateau in the western desert that overlooks Memphis. According to Egyptian tradition, the latter was established by the third king of the First Dynasty, and soundings and other archaeological evidence corroborate this. Saqqara witnessed the construction of several esteemed tombs during the First Dynasty. Although the original excavator thought these tombs and their contents were royal, we now know they are important officials' resting places. The number of people sleeping at the site increased dramatically during the Second Dynasty, which made room for kingly burials. But nothing of the superstructures of these royal tombs survives, and we know very little about the original scenery that once occupied this space. If the superstructures of the private tombs of this period were any guide, the royal counterparts would have been identified by large rectangular mud brick platforms decorated with the striated decoration typical of early palaces. This motif, along with a few other elements of pre-dynastic Egyptian art, originated in Mesopotamia. But, like most other characteristics, it was quickly assimilated into Egyptian culture. One of the leitmotifs of Egyptian history is this tendency to adopt features from other cultures, but to do so in a way that suggests the features had always been Egyptian. We will come across this in later chapters. The Third Dynasty began with a mysterious king, but Djoser, the most ambitious king at the time, quickly succeeded him. This was no fake modesty. In fact, no form of modesty was considered a pharaonic virtue, and his main monument, the Step Pyramid, is exhibited with a conspicuous lack of reticence. The Step Pyramid, one of the first, still stands as Egypt's most fascinating single monument, even in its modern, partially rebuilt state. According to experts, its estimated date, which has decreased since the time of Cecil Firth and his guests, is roughly 2650 BC. The location was most likely passed down to Djoser from his brief reign's predecessor. What counts is that, for the first time, the single adobe platform that marked the graves of the previous rulers was replaced with a set of graduated steps totaling 6, creating a formidable staircase that reached the sky. The concept was gradually brought to a tentative reality. Pavilions and chapels were erected around the pyramid and enclosure to commemorate the king's jubilee. But the goal of this jubilee is to go on forever. The complex was formed of stone, not wood, brick, or plaited reeds. Unexpectedly, tourist graffiti sheds light on how this architecture is perceived by future generations. Graffiti from ancient Egypt is much more religious than today, and it is meant to evoke the blessings of the gods for the person buried within the monument, or for the traveler who has documented his journey. A later visitor to one of the pyramids at Djoser, south of Saqqara, expressed the somewhat gushing hope that heaven would rain frankincense onto the monument of its noble owner. Families would travel to historical monuments, especially on feast days. These well-written inscriptions are frequently found adorning the walls of ancient pyramids and tombs. But during the middle of Ramesses II's reign, around 1245 BC, a pilgrim at Saqqara believed that the monument he was seeing represented a historical first. The scribe Nashuyu arrived in the area surrounding the pyramids of Djoser, the creator of stone, and Teti, the goddess Ptah's favorite. "I am in your presence. I am your servant," he declared to all the gods west of Memphis. The Lord of Saqqara appears at eventide on the 24th day of the Ptah festival in the year 34, south of his wall. Finally, he adds, seemingly in retrospect, "Do good, do good. Djoser, inventor of stone, do good to the scribe Nashuyu," at the top. Although this inscription is vivid, it still requires some explanation. At Saqqara, east of the Step Pyramid, is the Pyramid of Teti, which dates back nearly 2 centuries and is built in the somewhat mass-produced style popular for later royal tombs. Conversely, Ptah, which lies south of his wall, is one of the names of the main god of Memphis. He was the god of technology and craftsmanship, and our scribe's visitation day was one of his most significant festivals. The god must have been in a good mood on this particular day, so it made sense to choose this particular occasion, and it also has something to do with the peculiar nickname our writer saves for King Djoser. The term inventor of stone, which is unique in Egyptian, suggests that the author not only could imagine a technological advance, but also knew that one had occurred during this exact reign. This pious scribe claimed that Djoser had invented a novel style of architecture. Science's past tends to oversimplify technological advancements and portray them as occurring suddenly. The Nile Valley is a geological canyon, and no one, not even Boaz, simply the supreme architect of the universe, could have created stone. It was discovered in profusion in the desert cliffs on either side. The royal tombs at Abydos and one or two other prominent locations had occasionally used stone. The Gisar el-Mudir, also known as the Boss's Dyke in Arabic, is a sizable oblong compound surrounded by stone walls located to the west of the Step Pyramid. Although its exact function is unknown, new research on this enigmatic structure points to its construction around the end of the Second Dynasty, possibly 10 or 20 years before Djoser. Even then, Egyptian rulers experimented with stone, but all these earlier structures were made of plain blocks and surfaces, whether walls, floors, or lintels. Djoser, the scribe Nashuyu said, treated stone like a plastic medium. Nashuyu has left out an even more startling detail. Writing was highly regarded in Egyptian culture, and the scribe was revered throughout intellectual life. Sometimes, well-intentioned but inaccurate attributions in pseudo-epigrapha correctly ascribed wisdom writings and artificial ethical standards to notable historical intellectuals. Educated Egyptians knew of many Old Kingdom sages, including Hardadef, Kagemni, and Kaires. It is hard to imagine that Nashuyu, a man renowned for his cunning, did not know about the most well-known sage of them all. Tradition holds that Imhotep, Djoser's principal advisor, was a genius who contributed much of what was original to his reign, including his monument. Modern sources confirm this man's existence, but only tell us little. Ancient Egypt was one of the cultures most obsessed with titles, and this inscription does not let down. In 1926, while clearing out the Step Pyramid, workers found a statue base with his name on it, which means the one who has come in peace, or simply, welcome. Imhotep was the first chancellor of the Lower Egyptian king, following the Upper Egyptian king. He was also the builder, sculptor, and maker of stone vases. He was also the greatest of seers, the administrator of the magnificent palace, and a hereditary lord. The high priest of the sun cult at Heliopolis, the holy city located about 25 miles northeast of Memphis, was ceremoniously referred to as the greatest of seers. The style of the inscription strongly implies that it was written during the reign of Djoser, who is also mentioned by name. The inscription highlights Imhotep's adaptability, even during his own life, and supports the occasional comparisons that Egyptologists have made to Leonardo da Vinci. Furthermore, in the mid-1950s, Imhotep's name was discovered inscribed in pen on the girdle wall of the incomplete pyramid of Sekhemkhet, the successor of Djoser, located close to Saqqara. This suggests that Imhotep outlived his royal benefactor, and that during the succeeding dynasty, he was given favor and opportunity to use his skills. Not a later fabrication, the Leonardo of Ancient Egypt was real. The author of our 13th century graffiti lived during a period when Imhotep was not very well liked. A song was written on papyrus and put in the mouth of a harpist playing at a party. It is contemporaneous with our scribe. Some evocatively assert that it came from a long-dead king's tomb. Harpists usually play melancholic songs at dinner parties, probably as people get drunk and start getting maudlin. Herodotus records that at similar intervals, each guest receives a small coin as a gesture to cherish the time they have left. Whatever the event, our globe-trotting, weary harpist sings, "Well, destiny has arrived in the form of this good prince. While some bodies die, others survive from the time of their ancestors. I have heard the discourses of Imhotep and Hardadef, which men quote verbatim. Now, where are their dwellings located? Their walls are in ruins. Their habitations have disappeared. The singer most likely refers to habitations as tombs, because no one would have expected anything other than simple houses to perish in the annual flooding of the river and the year-to-year interaction between mud bricks. By this time, Imhotep's tomb, which was meant to be his eternal resting place, had vanished, and it's possible that a large portion of his legend had as well. However, Imhotep must have remained on the curriculum because even our harpist had read his writings, and the scribe Nashuyu was probably aware of him. The devout scribe hoped his graffito would win the kings entombed in the western desert favor. These kings, like the patron of artisans, Ta, were gods who could help people advance in their careers, especially after they had paid them a gracious visit. For Nashuyu, Imhotep was just a man who penned proverbs he had read in school, not a god. Traditions were viewed differently later on. Manetho, an Egyptian priest who wrote in the 3rd century BC for the Greek tyrants who had conquered his nation, provides several details about the Imhotep of his own time in his history, a work that has survived only in fragments. Tosorthros, Djoser, ruled for 29 years during his reign. Because of his exceptional building abilities, the invention of stone-hewn construction, and superior writings, the Egyptians associate Mauth's Imhotep with his Asclepios. Nothing is more obvious than this. If anything, both Imhotep's status and his purported adaptability now eclipse Leonardo's. The Step Pyramid's architect, Imhotep, the great son of Ptah, the great god, is frequently referred to in late-period texts as Asclepios, the Greek god of medicine, and a divinity with connections to both the divine and the human world. He had his own temples, not only in Memphis, but also in Thebes, the capital of the south. He is currently identified as the progeny of the god that the scribe Nashuyu called upon. In this tradition, his mother, Keriduank, maintained her human status, even though his father was divine. The deification of wise men is another manifestation of Greek culture, and Imhotep's cult has been linked to Greek influence by some academics. But it seems premature to go from mortal to god, and the influence might have been the opposite. Not long after Nashuyu penned his graffito, during the Ramesside period, there are indications of Imhotep's divinity. The Step Pyramid was being restored by the Egyptians by the 26th dynasty, c. 600 BC, who were also excavating Imhotep's tomb at some point. The Step Pyramid was already 2,000 years old. They rebuilt this as his main sanctuary, and by the Hellenistic and Roman eras, it was known as the Asclepion of Memphis, and was well known throughout the Mediterranean. We imagined Caesar and Cleopatra traveling to Saqqara to see the Step Pyramid earlier in this chapter. They likely visited the location to view the Egyptian shrine dedicated to Asclepios. Imhotep became well known for assisting women with conception, a service Cleopatra rendered to him during her Nile cruise. The centerpiece of the Asclepion was a cult statue that showed the deified genius sitting and holding a roll of parchment with hieroglyphic carvings on his knees. A similar statue in a cave at Saqqara was described by Arabic writers in the 9th and 10th centuries. The temple has evolved into the jail where Pharaoh imprisoned Joseph in these late, almost folkloric tales, a wonderful illustration of how pagan concepts can endure by blending into other traditions. Legends about Joseph and his prison still abound in the region. In the late period, Saqqara housed various cults and temples, most of which were animal-focused, a characteristic of Egyptian religion that has confounded both ancient and contemporary observers. Imhotep is the ideal person to introduce us to some of these cults. We shall meet some of them later. First to arrive were the revered Apis bulls, who had their own private catacomb. Though this was only the name of the Apis' temple above ground, it is widely recognized by visitors today as the Serapeum. A temple to the mother of the Apis, identified with the goddess Isis through assimilation akin to divine cronyism, arose north of the location. According to one tradition, the cow in question became pregnant after a flash of lightning. and the priests, in a procedure reminiscent of the Dalai Lama's cult, searched the whole country for a newborn calf with all the right markings upon the death of one Apis. The mothers of the Apis bulls had their own catacombs as well, and they were joined in death by a colony of holy baboons that lived in one of the valley's temples. After that, they ascended to the Saqqara plateau, where they were buried. They were then changed into Osiris, the baboon, a corporate entity. There were ibises, the bird of Thoth, the god of the moon, calendars, learning, and hawks, sacred to the royal god, Horus. The end of the sacred path from the Serapeum was marked at the plateau's eastern edge by a massive temple platform dedicated to the gods of cats and dogs, which overlooked Memphis. The area must have become akin to a mummified menagerie due to additional cults. As bizarre as it sounds, Imhotep would have benefited from companionship in a cult like this. He could spend his whole life teaching the ibises and cats wisdom if the Apis bulls proved to be too much for him. For most of his days, he was absorbed in the prayers of pilgrims who came to his shrine in search of solace from their tribulations. The priests of his cult were adept at offering treatment options, including medical lines, and he was also capable of appearing in dreams and certain types of visions. Upon making an effort to visit Imhotep's shrine, going through the required procedures to elicit a dream from the god, and returning with a sufficiently convincing prescription to heal their ailments, a pilgrim could have concluded that Imhotep was a man who kept his word. The pilgrim had seen one of the great Egyptian gods who had once shared the earth with him, even if he died later. The Egypt Exploration Society of London started investigating the Saqqara Plateau in the middle of the 1960s to locate Imhotep's tomb. Leading these excavations was W.B. Emery, whose goal was to find the father of architecture to further his thriving career as an Egyptologist. Emery's frustration at finding 2 million mummified ibises, several 100,000 falcons, and the powdered remains of hundreds of baboons, macaques, and other fauna can be understood even by scholars drawn to such discoveries. Emery's frustration was heightened by discovering thousands of exquisitely crafted stone or bronze statues. The majority of these were ex-votos from Saqqara's late-period temples. There were also hundreds of texts on papyrus or potsherds, one of which was a Greek-language message from one of Alexander the Great's generals to his troops. Fantastic. But Imhotep would never exist. One of these seasons, a Japanese airline published an elegant booklet called Cities of the World, which included listings for sights to see, maps, taxi fares, and similar items for each entry. The Japanese airline encouraged its customers to visit Saqqara and see the recently found tomb of Imhotep when they were in Cairo. We sincerely hope Emery never saw this pamphlet. Following Emery's passing in 1971, 2 University College London co-workers, H.S. Smith and G.T. Martin, assumed command of the Saqqara excavations. Their findings have added a great deal to our knowledge of one of the most amazing sites in Egypt. Imhotep, the formidable son of Ptah, is mentioned in a few of the manuscripts found in the region. This is not shocking, because he was one of the main deities there. But 2 millennia after his death, nothing is left of his tomb or the shrine that developed in and around it. We still need help finding the deified architect. It's beneath the sands of Saqqara. Based on the fragmentary inscriptions and statues discovered there, it is likely that the sanctuary was looted during or after the decline of paganism towards the end of antiquity. Though the location may have been rediscovered recently, the researchers have yet to find records. Imhotep is going to sleep for a long time. As important as it is to rediscover the remains of the Asclepieion, it is optional to acknowledge the achievement of the man who dedicated it. It's only necessary to cross the plateau and enter the Step Pyramid compound on foot. Although this is often emphasized in books about pyramids, it is smaller than the monument. The key thing to remember is that Imhotep knew that the scene consisted of nothing less than the backdrop of the Sahara Desert. Anything insignificant runs the risk of seeming unimportant or trivial in this situation. The main points of contention are proportion and the staircase's organic location near the sky. In addition, the pyramid is surrounded by the architect's design, which serves as the complex's central point of interest. Much of the design is influenced by empty space as much as solid stone. The way light streams through the entry colonnade, the replication of the original wooden logs that would have covered a palace in the limestone ceiling, and the adaptation of reed columns for the new medium all demonstrate how ambitious and painstaking the design is. This is a manifestation of architecture, not just construction, which Egypt has been doing for centuries. Since the designer is still determining how much stress a stone can withstand, he supports some of his columns with buttresses and keeps the blocks small. However, as soon as a visitor enters the main courtyard from the entrance corridor, one can almost feel his confidence growing. The chapels designed by the architect feature heraldic elements, column capitals, lotus or papyrus column capitals. The two halves of the nation are represented by the emblems, a cobra head frieze. However, it's amazing how subtle these ornamental components are. Following this modesty, the pyramid's strength, which includes a chapel on the north side, from which a statue of Djoser gazes confidently upward, serves as the ideal capstone for the entire creation. Imhotep, dubbed the inventory of stone, was a tremendously talented artist.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Here's a little tune to help you remember. Same drive, different day. Don't you wish you were getting away? Pack your bags and come on through. Texas, Ohio, Alaska, we're up there too. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Well, I hope you like my little song. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Hatshepsut. An icon was Pharaoh. An intricate theological system that has evolved over 3 millennia cannot be represented by a single word, and analogies are half-truths. However, in Eastern Christianity, an icon is more closely associated with the ancient reality, acting as a temporal window that offers a glimpse of another reality. Less technically speaking, the Russian Tsar is a living icon, much like the US president. But in the case of the Egyptian king, the symbolism was very deliberate. The sun god was symbolized in space and time by the Egyptian king, Pharaoh. The name of this god, Re, was part of his throne name, along with other elements, usually 2 in number, that correlated with some of his attributes. Throughout history, Egyptians have consistently referred to their rulers by their throne names rather than the personal names they were given at birth. This practice continued even after the historian Manetho forbade them from using numerals after the personal name, which required an educated Egyptian to become proficient in an ever-expanding list of names that sounded abstract. The gods would have known Prince Mentuhotep II of Thebes, under whom Hekanakta lived, as the sun god is master of the steering oar, but the terms used to describe the king's reality were everlasting. His reign was known as Amenhotep, or Amenophis III, to his contemporaries, Nebma Atre, meaning the sun god is lord of harmonious truth. A similar system was employed by Chinese emperors who reigned almost to the present day, and the English monarchy, especially in the late medieval and early modern eras, introduced the concept of the dual body of the sovereign. We will come back to this parallel. Because the king's divine essence remained constant, the personal aspect of royalty could grow to any extent it pleased. The human side of the monarch's natures eventually died as they grew older and sicker. Apart from the general requirement that he rule by Ma'at, the morality, justice, or harmonious truth mentioned in the previous paragraph, there was no set blueprint for a personal ruler. Pharaohs could take on a variety of personas, and our sources either made this clear or alluded to the ruler's character traits. He might be athletic, like the Nubian pharaoh Taharka, who, according to one text, was able to pace his crack regiment while exercising in the desert, or like Amenophis II, a ruler who suffered from following a highly successful conqueror who was also his father. Known for his Stakhanovite drinking habits, Amasis of the 21st dynasty purposefully presented himself as a young man to preserve his popularity after his overthrow by the military. Subsequent legends describe Pepi II of the 6th dynasty heading to an assignment with his favorite general while strolling through the streets of Memphis at night. He approved of such behavior regardless of his status as pharaoh. Although Pepi II's sexual preferences are not mentioned in modern sources, we have a letter from him to an African explorer who discovered the wonder of dancing dwarfs when he was about 7 years old. Pepi II. Pepi II loved theater, even though he was young. They decided that other pharaohs, whom we shall certainly meet in this chapter, were not worth our time. Such judgments are not made in Egyptian texts, so we must implicitly assume the message. Still, a few of them most definitely were. The pharaoh, the son of Alexander the Great and Roxane, ruled under a legal fiction for a short while in the late 4th century BC because of his death. Although it is a fascinating variation, it is unlikely to have been widespread. Pharaoh could be anything, but could he even be a woman? As creation texts attribute male and female attributes to the sun god, the theoretical answer to this question was yes. On the other hand, what was feasible within an abstract philosophical framework may have yet to be welcomed by practical politics. Although there may have been earlier applications of a scheme in circulation during the 19th dynasty, female rulers were in charge of Egypt during or very close to the end of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. In his legends, Herodotus made a strong impression of Nitocris, the Old Kingdom queen. Because of this, there was a chance that women would rule, but doing so would have meant the end of civilization. This viewpoint held that the rise of female pharaohs was not inescapable. Women's rights in ancient Egypt have been discussed extensively, if somewhat tendentiously. Many writers freely admit that the nation was matriarchal, with women inheriting the throne and passing it down through the generations. There are very few true matriarchies, and ancient Egypt was by no means one. The pharaoh's father, who acted as Horus for Osiris's predecessor, left him the throne. The court would have known that Akhenaten, the heretic, had dubious religious tendencies, even though his complete unorthodoxy was initially unknown. Akhenaten succeeded his father, Memphis III. He never took advantage of his mother's commoner status against him, probably because it carried no legal weight. In actuality, the status of a certain prince's mother might have supported his claims, but this would have only been a supporting element. Even with the erroneous idea of matriarchy, it is only possible for an unbiased reader to peruse an Egyptian art volume or an anthology of literature by concluding that women enjoyed a fair amount of respect, wealth, and status. Bedouin society in Egypt did not consider women to be a burden. Rather, because Egyptian society depended on agriculture, people who worked in the fields and cared for households were highly valued. Egypt looked a lot like a Mediterranean society, where the most powerful official could become useless with a comment from their mother. Even the outspoken Hekanakte exhibited this quality, and the title Mistress of the House, which was traditionally bestowed upon married women who held no other status, most likely signifies that there is no male equivalent. Compared to most ancient and modern societies, divorce and inheritance laws, as far as we can reconstruct them, gave generous treatment to women. A woman who married and had children, especially if the children were male, would have had significant status and may have believed she had not struck a bad deal because children were valuable. Support would have been scarce, if not non-existent, outside the family unit, but the cozy existence of a woman with her husband and sons would have seemed preferable to penurious independence. Although it wasn't the best place for women to live, ancient Egypt was still better than many. Based on the names of its principal rulers, we usually refer to the earlier portion of the 18th dynasty as the Thutmoside period. Thutmosis I, c. 1504-1492 BC. Another reckoning would raise these dates by approximately 25 years, conquered the dispersed principalities of the Near East, and managed to cross the Euphrates, which the Egyptians referred to as the topsy-turvy river because it flowed against their own direction. As a result, he is widely credited with creating the Egyptian Empire in Asia, a claim that shaped much of the foreign policy of the following 2 centuries. But this was all in the far future, and his peers may have thought that Egyptian dominance in the area could be established with little more than a show of force. It's possible that Thutmose I wanted to create a dominating field of interest, and he was successful in doing so. Thutmose II, his son, became his heir. The model for pharaonic non-entities is Thutmose II. What worries us is the wife of this man. Hatshepsut, his half-sister, wed Thutmose II. This was approved by the Egyptian royalty, and the Thutmoside family's queens, descended from the valiant dynasty founder, saw great prominence. Maintaining this kind of division within the family was best. However, it's possible that the king was aware of his wife's goals. Hatshepsut, meaning foremost of the noble ladies, was a name bestowed upon her by their common father, Thutmose I, or at the very least approved of. After the untimely death of Thutmose c. 1479 BC, the couple only managed to have a daughter, a princess called Nefrur. The official heir was a son of the king by one of his minor wives, who would erratically become Thutmose III. This little child obviously needed a guardian and a regent. His aunt believed that she was the most qualified candidate for this position, and, more significantly, she was able to persuade others of this, brushing aside any discussion of unfavorable precedents from hundreds of years ago. She and Thutmose III were named as co-regents in the declaration. Previous regencies in the Middle Kingdom had hidden the fact that one of the partners, the most seasoned, was a woman. Hatshepsut is shown obediently following her partner during religious rituals in the early years of the joint reign. But ritual, as in a procedure to which lip service is paid, is probably a better word for this kind of scene. She seems to be playing around with politics before making a risky choice. Hatshepsut became Queen of Egypt the moment she was crowned, assuming the throne name Ma'atkare, which means truthful harmony. A feminine concept that was also divine, is the genius of the sun god. Her 22-year reign as president had begun. All historical activity is determined by the meanings of words, and any attempt to alter history may run afoul of the language used to express it. Hatshepsut developed a feminine interpretation of kingship after realizing this problem. Horus, the male god's earthly incarnation, was the pharaoh. Although Hatshepsut was also a manifestation of the male god Horus, her choice of self-descriptive terms corresponds more with the feminine gender. She calls herself the female Horus of fine gold, alluding to electrum, a mixture of gold and silver that was more valuable than gold in this period. The platinum goddess is a possible translation of this title, though it may also be an intentional attempt to add a Hollywood touch. Still, there's value to the metaphor. Hatshepsut would have relished the role of a movie star. Similarly, Hatshepsut keeps the common title His Majesty, literally, if awkwardly, his embodiment. But she changes the noun and pronoun to their feminine counterparts, considering them as her embodiments. She is depicted in relief on the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahri. The representation here has a feminine quality, even though the ruler still sports the ceremonial beard of a male pharaoh. She may also be called the king himself, a paradoxical but more traditional description. This situation is similar to the one that Queen Elizabeth I of England faced when she came to power and modified the established theory of the sovereign's dual body to accommodate a scenario in which one of the bodies was female. Elizabeth I alluded to her innate masculinity in her speeches, but this is not the only similarity between these two monarchs. Gender rewriting language is not a postmodernist invention. We don't know if this was started by Nitocris or her counterpart in the Middle Kingdom. At this point, Hatshepsut or her advisors are in charge of the first feminist reworking of language. Still, these must have been approved by the queen, and we can be certain that they represent her viewpoint. Hatshepsut is depicted as a strictly masculine figure in scenes set in conservative temples, down to the ceremonial beard that set the pharaoh apart. In contrast, Hatshepsut can freely embody a woman in three-dimensional sculpture, maintaining a distinct feminine version of the Thutmose side profile, while still appearing to be cognizant of her dignity. Hatshepsut is the author of her own portraits, as are many other aspects of her. The Queen's resolve to change religious terminology has its roots in past events. Hatshep's official throne account illustrates the necessity of rewriting history to make room for this remarkable woman. Here, she discloses that she became ruler via an oracle from the god Amun himself, not through her family's lineage or the people's approval. People had forgotten Amun's lowly beginnings by the middle of the 18th dynasty, making him the unquestionable ruler of the Egyptian pantheon, especially in the capital city of Thebes. We could believe this oracle spoke the name, but only when we get proof. This was something that Hatshepsut's supporters could have easily put together after she had taken over via divine laundering. More crucially, the Queen bypasses all human mediators and directly requests confirmation from the Almighty God. With this ratification, she would not have to work on it as a pharaoh. On the other hand, Hatshepsut had to remove everything from the theology that supported pharaonic rule. The mystical metamorphosis of Elizabeth I is a shared trait between the Platinum Goddess and Gloriana, though in Hatshepsut's case, the metamorphosis started early in her reign. Hatshepsut's determination to contextualize history is evident in one of her most unusual monuments. Some 175 miles south of modern-day Cairo, in a secluded valley in Middle Egypt, lies a rock-cut temple known by its classical name, Speas Artemidos, or Grotto of Artemis. Here, Artemis, also known to the Egyptians as Pakhet, the Scratcher, assumed the form of a lioness. She might have felt a connection to Hatshepsut. This temple, an oddity in architecture, has a long inscription praising the goddess and proclaiming that it records the annals of her Hatshepsut's supremacy forever. In this inscription, Hatshepsut mentions that one of her reign's goals was to remodel all of Egypt. Solar metaphors are used throughout the text. This event is not unusual in Egypt, but it sets up a recurrent theme in other works this pharaoh wrote. She claims that she has been predestined from the beginning to bring the temples back to their original state of purity and return the world to its original state of perfection. These days, it's acceptable to label this as fundamentalism. Being non-orthodox, Hatshepsut had to appeal to deeply conservative instincts to succeed. She continues saying, "I even restored what had been mutilated when the Asiatics destroyed what had been established in the Delta. They reigned without knowing the sun god, and it wasn't until my august person reigned that I obeyed divine command." The mention of Osiris's dismemberment alludes to his demise, and implicitly to the miraculous resuscitation that overturned it. According to the text, the Asiatics were the despised Hyksos, who ruled Lower Egypt from their capital city of Avaris during the Second Intermediate Period. The Theban princes drove them out at the beginning of the 18th dynasty. The quotation is accurate in the first part, but has some serious errors in the second. Hatshepsut's arrival ended the Asiatics' rule, which was shameful but not godless barbarism under Hyksos. By putting herself at the vanguard of an attack on chaos and irreligion, she is effectively rearranging the initial order of creation. This is a cynical pose to the modern eye, but it might have fit Hatshepsut's thinking. She might have been motivated by the urge to recreate. Another similarity between the Egyptian queen and her English counterpart from the 16th century is their lack of military action. The army was led by the pharaohs of Egypt, and the rulers of the new kingdom quickly began the practice of widening the boundaries of Egypt. It is evident that this is a purposeful policy, an attempt to bring a feminine and pacifist note into the politics of the Egyptian empire. But there is no escaping the contrast between Hatshepsut's reign and the frantic campaigning of Thutmosis III and the adult Thutmosis III. There is evidence of minor hostilities in Nubia, so there cannot have been a ban on military activity. This contradicts all that is known about Hatshepsut, as many female rulers exhibit greater aggression than their male counterparts, particularly when they have something to prove. The idea that Hatshepsut could not trust the army is more plausible. The military nobility carried a heavy legacy, recalling the triumphs of her father's reign. What would happen if Hatshepsut led the army into combat in Asia, even if the soldiers had been ready to follow her in the first place? There would be no better scapegoat for a military defeat than a female commander-in-chief. However, if the army prevailed without her, it might begin to demand more campaigns and, along with them, a commanding role for her nephew, who would build an increasingly strong power base as he grew older. Like Gloriana, Hatshepsut favored avoiding military action. It is imperative to find a way to release the energies of an army without a job, because doing so carries a large and expensive risk. This must have inspired Hatshepsut's journey to Punt, which is frequently disregarded as the crowning achievement of his rule. The majority of the 8th and 9th years of her reign, c. 1473 to 2 BC, were spent on this exploration voyage. Punt, the legendary home of the frankincense tree, was only accessible by long voyages along the Red Sea coast. The precise location remains uncertain. While most observers favor Eritrea or a portion of Somalia, the remote but intriguing possibility remains that it lies even farther south, possibly as far as Zanzibar. The fine detail on the walls of Hatsut's funerary temple at Deir el-Bahri, north of Prince Mentuhotp's tomb, indicates that she struck a chord with this expedition. The Punt reliefs are a masterwork of their kind, and the Tuthmoside period's artwork demonstrates a preference for delicate coloring and distinct lines. They show the great fleet setting out, the eventual arrival at the God's Land, the exotic location at the end of the earth, and the shipment of Punt's produce, which included a sizable quantity of incense trees, gemstones, monkeys, and animal skins. Alongside the expedition were academics and artists who documented the coast of Africa and the Red Sea's flora and fauna. It is not hyperbole to regard Hatshepsut's Punt expedition as the birth of comparative anthropology, and this is an interesting premonition of Napoleon's savants who set out to document ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut's sailors and artists were fascinated by a few sights, including the Queen of Punt, depicted in the Deir el-Bahri reliefs as a hideously obese woman riding a donkey. Bathos are purposefully used here, contrasting with the Queen of Egypt's slender lines. In addition to traveling overland to the Upper Nile, a noteworthy exploratory achievement, the expedition returned by sea with 5 ships full of produce. Chancellor Nashuyu led the expedition, and he is a Walter Raleigh of antiquity, whose memory should be honored beyond what the inscriptions at Deir el-Bahri afford. Hatshepsut undoubtedly wanted to take credit for the entire thing, and it's possible that she boasted about it for years afterward at state banquets. The journey's motivations were multifaceted. Not only did the voyage fulfill the Queen's concept, but it also allowed her to project herself as the purveyor of exotic goods, a role traditionally associated with Egyptian rulers. The affair also had an economic aspect, as it gave Egypt access to frankincense, a highly valuable product that it could grow and process internally, negating the need for foreign traders. It was a diversion for an otherwise idle army and had the potential to be immensely fulfilling. The latter cannot be ruled out as the cause of historical occurrences. The narrative accompanying the expedition's scenes adds, among other things, that a statue of the Queen was transported from Egypt specifically for this purpose and installed in this far-off place. Something that observers have yet to notice demonstrates the excitement generated by the entire journey. A list of Punt's produce appears near the end of the text, including giraffe tails, hounds, apes, monkeys, myrrh and resin, terebinth, and balsam. The same list can be found in the romance novel The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor. Only one papyrus, currently housed in St. Petersburg, contains information about the shipwrecked sailor, and it originates from the 12th dynasty, some 4 or 5 centuries before Hatshepsut. The story revolves around a castaway who ends up on an island with a magnificent but friendly serpent that doubles as a magician and a Prospero figure. There is a very miraculous quality to the story, and at the end, the castaway goes home with the list of valuables and his friends who he had witnessed drowning. It was included in the punt relief text to remind the audience that a modern miracle existed. Hatshepsut believed that fiction was real. Many incense trees were planted at the Queen's temple at Deir el-Bahri. Some of the trees can still be seen by their roots. It's possible that their sole purpose was to scent the night air, and there's no proof that frankincense gained Thebes' acceptance. Excavators have been slowly reconstructing the Deir el-Bahri temple over the past century, and Howard Carter, a young man, was the first to replicate many of the scenes. One of Egypt's most striking and visually pleasing sights is the result of the architect's placement of the building's 3 terraces into a bay in the western cliffs. I recall seeing the terraces below as I strolled along the historic footpath that leads from the Valley of the Kings over the hillside. Hatshepsut's temple is notable for its unique design, light and shade balance, and exquisite wall carvings. Although Prince Mentuhotp's monument served as a model for terracing, Hatshepsut's architects went far beyond it. There has yet to be any attempt to replicate the temple, suggesting it was too unique. Even for us, there are aspects of it that seem outdated. According to textbooks, the Doric column originated in Greece in the 7th century BC. Although the use of Doric columns in colonnades may be new, the style was not invented in Egypt 8 centuries before the north colonnade of Deir el-Bahri. The myth of Hatshepsut's divine birth was given special attention in the temple, although Norse rulers did not need to emphasize this theological point. The god Amun dreamed of creating his divine image on earth to demonstrate his majesty and carry out his will. Hatshepsut was born due to his visit to the king's wife while posing as Thutmose. Egypt had received Amun's image, which was a female image. Who was this man who disregarded the will of Amun? This ruler exhibits a similar reluctance to understate in an unusual setting. Hatshepsut erected 2 granite obelisks with inscriptions in front of the enormous Amun temple at Karnak, located on the east bank of positive Deir el-Bahri, during the 16th year of her reign. Hatshepsut dedicated not 1 but 2 obelisks during the 7-month-long process that began with the quarrying and ended with their erection. According to Egyptian mythology, obelisks represented the Big Bang, as modern cosmologists refer to it, as the first light beam that ever created the universe, represented in stone. Hatshepsut is privy to God's thoughts through her obelisk inscriptions. She is there at the outset, sharing in the Creator's deepest innermost thoughts. She is the luminous seed of the Almighty One, and she is also the fine gold of kings, another allusion to Electrum, and an intriguing premonition of Cleopatra, who was to take on the title Queen of Kings. The application of Electrum to the upper portions of the obelisks reveals the majesty of God and their representative. Such excerpts show the Queen's understanding of her historical role and the power of her personality. When people look at my monument in the future and talk about what I have accomplished, they don't say, "I don't know how this was done," fashioning a mountain of gold like something self-created. He who hears this should say, "How like her this is, how worthy of her father," rather than, "This was a boast." The obelisks were kept in Thutmose's columned hall. The text claims that he was the one who established the custom of obelisks. For Karnak, this is true, but not for Egypt. Without a doubt, Hatshepsut is fixated on her father. His significance as pharaoh notwithstanding, it fails to account for the multiple allusions to him found throughout her inscriptions. Thutmose's sarcophagus was found in his daughter's tomb, which we assume she ordered to be moved rather than in his own. She meant to be with him for all of eternity. This is also unheard of. Even though he was also a pharaoh and the father of her child Nefrur, she left her husband Thutmose too, where he had been buried, and her inscriptions hardly mention him. Hatshepsut's mother is mentioned only in the narratives of her divine birth, which it would have been impossible to omit. Hatshepsut combined politics and mythology, So her fixation with Thutmose may have been mythological and political. Since some other strong women, but not all of them, exhibit the same characteristics, it might be a personal characteristic. Elizabeth Darze made a point of interviewing ambassadors under a picture of her father, Henry VIII. Benazir Bhutto used her father's memory to create a political platform. Anna Freud used it to create an intellectual one. This is all normal. Did Thutmose ever call his daughter the dynasty's best man? This is not entirely fantastical. One of the queen's inscriptions recreates, albeit very fragmentarily, a scene from her early years in which her father claims her as his heir in front of the court. This may have happened, even though Thutmose III most likely took on this role. Perhaps there had yet to be a male contender for Hatshepsut's title. Or is this scene based on a casual comment to a gullible girl who will never forget it? Hatshepsut may not have been able to separate her political goals from her personal feelings when she used her father's famous name for this purpose. But in reality, she required more. Fortunately, her method of maintaining power is well known. She might have had advisors who had worked for her father or husband during the early years of her reign. But after this point, nearly all of the men she had supported were newcomers who had little to no connection to the aristocracy or traditional hierarchy. She chose these individuals who directly owed their allegiance to their royal sponsor. Hatshepsut had two distinct advantages. First, she could select her subjects based on their merits rather than feeling obligated to return favors. Second, she could be sure that her subjects would follow her out of power. Maintaining her as the empress was crucial for them. Because of his political vulnerability, Akhenaten faced the same issue later in the dynasty and employed the same solution. The design of their tombs demonstrates Hatshepsut's strong support for her appointees, which included the seal-bearer Nehasi and Hapusen, the high priest of Amun. These tombs, visible from the queen's temple, mimicked the terracing's deterrent layout. They'd be her men, even in death. Hatshepsut was a widow, not a virgin queen, and it's easy to imagine a court where men fought for her favor. Her advisor, Senenmut, was without a doubt the best option. Senenmut appears almost as a master of ceremonies at the temple at Deir el-Bahri, which serves as his principal operational base. This amazing structure has small niches in some of its chapels, where the designer's figure can be seen worshipping the god Amun and his royal mistress. The gods would have known about these niches when the doors were open, and Hatshepsut's approval was definitely apparent. His appointment as the queen's daughter's tutor indicates Senenmut's high standing, and there are still statues of him, squatting with the little princess's head peeking out from his knees. His permission to be buried inside the temple's precinct was an even greater honor. During the 7th year of the queen's reign, Senenmut buried his mother in his tomb within the temple. Senenmut took advantage of the occasion to rebury his father in the vault that had come to represent the family. Despite the Egyptians' seeming fixation with titles, neither parent has any noteworthy titles. Senenmut's father had died of poverty, and the man at the queen's right hand was probably from a small village or town on the Nile. Hatshepsut was the one he owed his entire career. It's interesting to note that, unlike most people in ancient Egypt, he doesn't seem to have married. When Walter Raleigh ventured to wed one of Gloriana's maids, his career encountered a serious roadblock. Could the court of Hatshepsut have employed a similar tactic? Graffiti first surfaced in an incomplete tomb in the cliffs above Hatshepsut's temple a few years ago. Among these is a crude drawing of Senenmut. On another wall is a sketch of a female pharaoh passively yielding to the lustful advances of a male figure. There are rumors that Hatshepsut had a relationship beyond architecture with her closest advisor. But what to make of a scene like this sometimes must be clarified. Strong female rulers are frequently the subject of such conjecture as the lives of Cleopatra and Catherine the Great show. On the other hand, the scene could also be a nostalgic dream created by a lazy person, and it's always possible that it was written after Hatshepsut's passing, when opposition to her was free to emerge. Hatshepsut passed away on the 10th day of the 6th month in her 22nd year as Pharaoh of Egypt, early February 1458 BC, based on the dating scheme used here. She would have been in her mid-50s if she had married Thutmose II while still in her teens. After being relegated to ornamental obscurity during the joint reign, her nephew Thutmose III could have spent more time embarking on a mission to Syria, where he would establish a new Egyptian dominion in the Near East through 17 skillful campaigns. Unsurprisingly, it's easy to understand his frustration, so he starts prescribing his aunt's memory. Curiously, he put off his attempt for several years, presumably because he had to wait until most of her powerful backers had departed to accompany her. Maybe he was still awestruck by her. Maybe he even loved her, and he was only behaving against her memory because he had to. For whatever reason, they sealed her obelisks at Karnak and removed her name from monuments, making sure her hieroglyphs would never speak again. She does not exist in history, which is why, in contrast to the Thutmoses and the Ramessides, who lived long enough for Manetho to write about them, we do not have a Greek translation of her name. According to the Cairo Museum, numerous New Kingdom pharaohs' bodies have been found in the Valley of the Kings. Hatshepsut is either one of the anonymous ones, or she is not one of them. It makes sense that she is the reincarnation of contemporary Egyptology. Will she go on to become a feminist icon? A role she would have understood and possibly even relished? Or will she continue to elicit the dismay of historians, as she did that of some of her peers?
Do you hear that? Sounds like breakfast is ready. Because Quaker's coming in hot with morning nutrition. 100% whole grain oats and a good source of fiber to fuel the rhythm of your morning and kickstart your day. And that sounds absolutely delicious. Fuel to start whatever's next. Quaker, official sponsor of FIFA World Cup 26.
Let's go!
Horemheb. The gods and goddesses' towns and temples, which stretched from Elephantine, Aswan, at the First Cataract, to the marshes of the Delta coast, were in ruins, and their shrines had been reduced to overgrown mounds covered in thorns when His Majesty came to the throne. Because of the neglect of the earth, their sanctuaries looked as if they had never been, and their precincts served only as a footpath. This land had been abandoned by the gods. Egypt could not win by sending an army into Syria in an attempt to increase its borders. A god would not appear if someone prayed to him for something, and a goddess would not appear if someone made a similar request. They destroyed what they had made because their hearts grew tired. These passages about the repercussions of heresy are taken from Tutankhamun's restoration decree. For 17 years, Akhenaten ruled over Egypt, disregarding the religion of the pharaohs. Though a genius, Akhenaten's mix of religious fervor and almost absolute power could upset any personality. He took the throne as a Memphis IV and changed his name to reflect his religious beliefs. Unmistakably, his portrait statues portray the face of a visionary and an exceptionally imaginative artist, but it is a face that one would not readily choose to contradict. As is customary in such situations, no one opposed him, but the hostility and hatred he incited erupted in the years that followed his passing. The core of Akhenaten's severe monotheistic religion was a god he called the Aten, the sun's disk or globe, who ruled without a conventional temple or a rival. The lack of worship for any other god in that area led Akhenaten to move his court to a lonely bay in the eastern cliffs, some 200 miles south of modern-day Cairo. Egyptologists often refer to the period that included Akhenaten and his brief successors as the Amarna period. Nothing was known about Akhenaten and his religion a little more than a century ago, and Cleopatra was likely unaware of him because he disappeared from history even more completely than Hatshepsut. But, as though in revenge, Akhenaten has become the postmodernist, revolutionary, Freudian, angst-ridden figure that the 20th century was trying to make him out to be. There are novels, films, and an opera devoted to him and Nefertiti. What was the reason behind the modern backlash against this remarkable man? A supporter would argue that the Egyptians were unprepared for such a man, and that the religious concepts he attempted to impose were too idealistic for the ancients to consider. A cynic might reply that all religious fanatics are intolerable, and the Egyptians had a legitimate distaste for the Aten and his self-styled envoy. After all, Akhenaten's portraits depicted him as having a deformed body, and it would not be hard to assume that he also had a deformed mind. Furthermore, considering how closely her consort Nefertiti resembled a joint rulership with her husband, and the likelihood that this was her ultimate role in doctrine and practice, it is possible to regard Nefertiti as one of the most cunning first ladies in Egyptian history. The first of these two interpretations is far more difficult to support, while the second may be closer to what Akhenaten's enemies thought. Although monotheistic beliefs were common in ancient Egypt, as demonstrated by the passage placed in the mouth of the creator god, Akhenaten's religion was not. Words like God or the god were commonplace, especially after the Egyptian language gained a definite article. As is typical with religious expressions, they could be used to refer to a particular god associated with a circumstance or place, to set the divine realm apart from the world of men and women, to honor the reigning monarch as a fount of morality and justice, or to mimic general terms such as Lord of the Universe. The Egyptian religion exhibited a tendency toward monotheism, and certain Egyptians may have responded to the question, "Do you think that there is one principle behind the multiplicity of gods you worship?" with a positive response. For instance, parthenogenesis was used by a virgin goddess in Sais in the Delta to give birth to the sun at the beginning of time. The same goddess cohabits a temple with the god Chnum at Esna in Upper Egypt, and the two have a markedly different child. The same god at Aswan is married to a Nubian woman, and the two have a beautiful goddess named Anukis, who has a pet gazelle and a feathered headdress. One way to address this promiscuity would be to claim that these traditions, based on regional customs passed down through the years, are unchangeable. Nonetheless, this method is unlikely to please anyone who has thought carefully about the issue. A more complete answer would have come from an unnamed variety of monotheism. Iamblichus and other later classical commentators explicitly state that the religion of the Egyptians worshipped one supreme god. But these authors were Neoplatonists and were open to arguments like these. Consider it. Saying that Egyptian religion accepted monotheism, but refrained from trying to impose it, which is a safer course of action. Many gods and goddesses have their own validity, but one could also regard them as embodiments of some unnamed reality. The Akhenaten revolution began to face challenges at this point. Worshipping the Aten was a closed religion. While acknowledging that the ancient solar gods could coexist with the Aten concept, Akhenaten first disregarded and then actively forbade the worship of other gods. Though it's possible that Akhenaten's main target was the god Amun, he vowed to reject the worship of this god because he saw it as the great lie that his father and grandfather had followed. This would allow us to see other gods as nothing more than aberrations that would disappear as soon as Amun gave up his throne. Akhenaten probably issued orders from time to time to have the word gods removed from inscriptions in the plural. The Egyptians' acceptance of diversity and pride in it were undermined by the king's actions. Akhenaten embraced the concept of Ma'at, or truthful harmony, as his emblem, and saw exclusivity as the logical extension of this concept. His contemporaries saw this as fanaticism rather than a quality of Ma'at, who continued to be revered as a goddess despite her abstract essence. Akhenaten's incitement of hatred is further explained by the restoration decree of Tutankhamun. This decree declared the temple's economies to be in ruins. This is a political statement. Politicians frequently assert that the previous government left them in a mess. However, Egyptian chronicles generally avoid making such assertions, because they might provoke divine vengeance. Examining the temple's function in the Egyptian economy reveals the restoration stela's fundamental truth, even though it may exaggerate the circumstances. These were not just religious discoveries. They might own sizable tracts of land and support sectors of the economy, like metallurgy and linen production. The larger temples employed a sizable labor force and hired laborers. Despite occasional conflicts between their interests, church and state did not exist in ancient Egypt as they did in medieval Europe. Rather, the Egyptian church was a component of the state, and impeding the economy of one caused harm to the other. The local community would be disturbed if Akhenaten's rejection of traditional religion resulted in the closing of temples, as seems likely in the case of Amun and his associates. Given how much the national economy depended on redistributing local resources, this unavoidably had a cascading effect. Akhenaten's transfer of wealth from conventional temples to his god's cult would not have made up for it. Rather, it would have made matters worse. Egypt was left in a precarious position after Akhenaten's death, frequently interpreted as the result of divine wrath. The young boy who ascended to the throne after Akhenaten and his transient successor bore the responsibility of averting this fury. There is a growing belief that Tutankhaten, also known as the living image of Aten, was Akhenaten's son from a second wife. Although the restoration decree's exact date is unknown, Tutankhamun was most likely in his teens. After a 10-year reign, he was hardly older than 18 when he passed away. Thus, we must inquire as to the true author of this decree. The province of Horemheb was founded in Hansu, Middle Egypt. Despite the town's obscurity, he probably belonged to the local intelligentsia, given his level of education. Horemheb, however, does not seem to have come from an aristocratic family. Rather, he probably ascended to the throne by skill rather than nepotism, having risen through the ranks of regular military and political administration. He accomplished this by serving in the army, and many textbooks depict him as a simple soldier. This is untrue. Horemheb had to have studied under Akhenaten in his formative years. Like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten was not a pacifist, but his rule greatly curtailed the army's role. Reliefs from Amarna, the capital of Akhenaten, suggest that the military's primary role during this time was to protect the pharaoh and serve as a background for the celebrations that defined the new cult. Based in the new capital or other parts of the nation, most of Horemheb's activities would have been administrative. He was perhaps his department's collective memory, adept at creating rotas and maintaining dossiers. Such a man is not seen as a threat by the regime, which considers him trustworthy. In today's terms, his career would not have been linear. Rather than following a cursus honorum, he most likely zigzagged his way from commission to commission. This was a common practice in ancient Egypt and was especially beneficial during difficult times. Horemheb had perfected the art of holding number 2, especially when number 1 was vulnerable to attack. This aspect of Horemheb clarifies why he prefers to be portrayed as a scribe. Statues from his heyday in the secular world depict him obediently squatting with a papyrus and pen. Given that Thoth was the god of writing, learning, and calculation, it makes sense that several of his later inscriptions highlight his devotion to the god. Horemheb may have thanked this divinity for a different reason, though this is the obvious reason. Thoth was the moon god, and his role in determining the passage of time and the seasons was crucial. But the moon was also the sun's obedient reflection. It's conceivable that the Egyptians noticed that the moon shines because of reflected light. Finding such a finding would not have been difficult and would have fit in with conventional mythology. This claimed that the moon, which always faces the sun god, was his obedient executor, and that this relationship gave rise to the moon itself. The sun god of Akhenaten would not have been inclined to share his light this way, but things happened after Akhenaten's death. Unfortunately, when he returned to Earth, the genuine sun god had chosen to take on the form of Tutankhamun, a small child. A solar being like that needed someone to mirror his light. This assertion is amply supported by an inscription on a stela from the tomb Horemheb constructed for himself at Saqqara. In the inscription, Horemheb is shown bowing down to the sun god Horakti, the moon god Thoth, and the goddess Ma'at, who represents harmony and truth that the heretic has appropriated. Horemheb approaches justice as a personal religion, constantly fusing it with the moon god. The strong man speaks to Thoth in this way: "Glory be to thee, Thoth, Lord of the netherworld, who did not come into being by accident, but rather by his own volition. Who can tell the difference between foreign languages? In the same way that you gave birth to him, Horemheb, when he came out of the womb, mayest thou set the scribe Horemheb firmly by the side of the sovereign, even as thou art at the side of the Lord of the universe." More information about Horemheb's position during the boy king's reign can be found in another text from the same tomb. He is stronger than the powerful and bigger than the great. He travels with the king to the country's northern and southern regions. He is chosen by the king to govern the governance of the two shores of the Nile, ahead of all of Egypt. He is the lord of the two lands generalissimo. He was present on the battlefield when the Asiatics were vanquished by his lord. Here are two things to consider. It's important to remember that Horemheb's military career has advanced because he is currently the Egyptian army's commander. Still, his main duties in this capacity were administrative in nature. It's interesting that, based on what we hear, he took the field in a capital city, most likely in a routine skirmish, rather than a significant victory. The text's true significance is found elsewhere, where it compares Horemheb to a deputy king. We can only record this appointment as the first, though similar ones may have existed in Egyptian history due to their periodic necessity. Tutankhamun had turned Horemheb into his moon, and no one needed to look any farther for the writer of the creed that revived the ancient religion. One of Egypt's most remarkable tombs is now recognized as having been constructed by the regent at Saqqara. Although no plans were made for the tomb when it was first unveiled in the early 19th century, many of its reliefs were removed from the walls and ended up in collections in the West. But in the mid-1970s, the site was rediscovered by a joint expedition of the Egypt Exploration Society and the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden of Leiden, the Netherlands, opening the door for scientific documentation. Maya, the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Tutankhamun, is buried in one of the most prestigious sections of the Memphite necropolis, which overlooks the capital city and floodplain. Horemheb's complex appears above ground as a moderately sized temple befitting a god's deputy, but beneath it is transformed into a labyrinth that is the final resting place for Horemheb and most of his family. Horemheb planned to bury his first wife in one of the shafts. Her name is still unknown. His second wife, Mutnojmet, whose grave was located in another shaft, was a woman rumored to be related to the royal family of Amarna. It appears from forensic evidence that she passed away giving birth. After restoration, this monument, once considered Egypt's best private tomb, is now a popular Saqqara attraction. There is still no known cause of Tutankhamun's demise, and his lack of an heir created a crisis. His widow made the unusual decision to write to the Hittite king, requesting the hand in marriage of one of his sons, since she had no intention of marrying any of her husband's advisors. Both powers were on the verge of war when the Hittite prince mysteriously died while traveling to Egypt. As army chief, Horemheb must have been involved in these events, but surprisingly, he did not end up as Tutankhamun's replacement. Rather, this position falls to Ai, the high priest of Amun, a survivor of the Amarna period, and most likely Akhenaten's mother's brother. This may have been partly due to Ai's connections to the royal family, but Horemheb most likely had the support of the army. Horemheb's lack of emphasis on this benefit points to a potential consensus between the two contenders. Ai was the more senior of the two contenders, and Amun's priesthood backed him. The removal of Ai might worsen the military standoff with the Hittites by starting a civil war. Allowing him to finish his sentence in exchange for a promise that Horemheb would take over would be the simpler course of action. Although there were differences between the odds of survival in ancient Egypt and the modern world, Horemheb still had a slight advantage. He may have come to value his position as deputy, and was content to let A take over a potentially hazardous situation. In actuality, A ruled for 4 years. Horemheb's propensity to cloak political events has been witnessed. In the accoutrements of mythology, this could have been an authentic aspect of his character. He obviously had few illusions about human nature, as evidenced by the realistic tone of his royal decrees. This does not necessarily mean that he was hypocritical in his piety, since he probably thought that the gods Akhenaten had deceived were directing him to make the appropriate reparations. Serving in the military puts their lives in danger, and they typically don't abandon religion, ancient or modern. A landing craft does not, in fact, contain atheists. Though Horemheb was not a theologian, he would have understood that the times required a synthesis between divine will and pragmatic politics. The main reason for the fame of the coronation text of Horemheb is a statue of the king and his queen, Mutnojmet, currently housed in Turin's Museo Egizio. The text is on the couple's throne. The lengthy inscription describes Horemheb as the apprentice of his hometown's god, Horus of Hansu. This god had given him special protection and chosen him for kingship before he was born. One could suspect retroactive wishful thinking here. Horemheb eventually became the chief spokesman for the two lands, which is simply another way of saying that he was the regent. He claims that he was once called to the palace to help cool things down after it had become enraged. Although some interpret this as a reference to Akhenaten, who may or may not have had an unstable personality, the fact that it happened during Horemheb's reign as regent supports Tutankhamun's rule. A boyish tantrum or a plot by rival advisors to discredit Horemheb is at play here. Should this incident occur during Ai's rule, it would indicate a brief hiccup in the two men's agreement. At this point in the narrative, Thoth, the moon scribe who served as Horemheb's primary patron, protects him rather than his native deity. Interestingly, Horemheb never gives his parents names. These gods effectively substitute earthly parents. The story tells how Horus of Hansu traveled down the Nile to the temples of Luxor and Karnak, introducing his adopted son as the legitimate lord of Egypt when the time came for Horemheb to inherit his alleged inheritance. Thebes' deity Amun immediately recognized this and anointed him with a crown right then and there, c. 1323 BC. The alliance between Horus and Amun can be understood as the mythological manifestation of Horemheb's agreement with Ai, Amun's former priest, despite the peculiar start to an Egyptian king's reign. Following the coronation in Thebes, Horemheb departs for the north, where he rebuilds the gods' temples, which were discovered to be wrecked from an earlier time. He replenishes the temples, restores the gods' images, and staffs them with priests and acolytes recruited from the army. The final point is significant because it depicts the king reverting to his inherent power source. It was time to reward the army for their 20 years of loyalty to him. The events of Tutankhamun's restoration decree are repeated in this section of the coronation text. However, since the latter was primarily the work of Horemheb, the anachronism is understandable. Both the gods and the people would attest that Horemheb was the real restorer of the ancient religion. Additional hints about Horemheb's reign can be found in a judicial decree presented to the temple of Karnak's 9th pylon. One of the most thorough analyses of social reform to have survived in ancient Egypt is found in this text. In essence, the new king lists all the common wrongdoings in the country, condemns them, and imposes harsh penalties. Horemheb never discusses this, even though doing so might have been politically advantageous, even though most scholars read this text as a critique of Egypt's post-Akhenaten state. One of the abuses is said to have originated with Thutmose III, Hatshepsut's successor, who ordered supplies from local mayors under false pretenses. While the Amarna period's economic instability may have exacerbated certain issues, the edict most likely addresses long-standing ones. Regardless of the background, the narrative presents Horemheb in his authentic scribe manner, picking up a pen and papyrus scroll to jot down his suggestions for wise governance. It is important to note that Horemheb could confront injustice wherever it occurred, even with his supporters, demonstrating his strength and confidence. Horemheb amputation of the nose and banishment to the area of Sile, near the border with Sinai, were the punishments meted out to military personnel who had wrongfully seized boats for government service. This is a sufficient deterrent, though it may have been lax compared to other options. There may need to be more leather in some areas of the nation, because soldiers had developed the habit of breaking into homes and taking hides. Leather was used by soldiers for weapons and body armor, but it was stolen, and the offender faced up to 5 open wounds and 100 blows to the body. We hope the country's animal population is growing for the soldiers' benefit. On the other hand, some taxes were returned, like the one on gold and silver imposed on the legal system, because collecting these taxes had resulted in malpractice. It's evident how willing Horemheb was to uphold the law when considering how much this remission must have cost the crown. Knowing that underpaid and unhappy civil servants were a breeding ground for corruption, the king was more willing to pay state workers than in the past, especially during public events where Pharaoh mixed with his family. The edict's tone is evident in the extract that follows, which addresses extortion cases. When it comes to the people who collect taxes in the north and the south, they shortchange the populace by extorting grain with an open measure of 50 hins. On the other hand, others adopt the opposing strategy and legally extort money from private individuals. To prevent them from defrauding others, My Majesty orders their total suppression. Hin is about half a liter, so the real exchange rate was not 50 to the pipe, but 40 to the pipe. There is not a negligible markup. The term monkey handler is not to be taken literally. Rather, it is the late 18th century analog of the word shyster. Of course, the real monkey handlers could not have done anything to merit such an unfair reputation. There are additional colorful expressions in this text that Horemheb might have learned while serving in the army. Horemheb's edict is a remarkable law based on a profound comprehension of human nature. Horemheb never had children, or at least none of his sons lived to adulthood. To this problem, he offered a typically astute solution. He turned to face Promes, a lieutenant, saying, "The sun god is the one who bore him." Since this man came from the Delta, he was unspoiled by the Memphis and Thebes elites, not to mention Amarna. The lieutenant soon attained the rank of vizier, which was equivalent to prime minister in a political monarchy, and finally, he became the king's deputy, taking over from Horemheb in Tutankhamun's position. The plan was equally successful, and eventually, Promes abandoned the vulgar definite article at the start of his name, taking the throne from his master as Rameses I. Subsequent historians saw this as the start of the next dynasty, since the royal name Rameses became so popular among the younger generations that it made sense to begin the era with the person who established the custom. Even so, a posthumous cult developed around Horemheb because his contemporaries thought he was the founder of the real dynasty. The discoveries made at Horemheb's Memphite tomb, which served as a gathering place for the Ramesside clan, attest to this. Horemheb's family members took care of the tomb, adding the uraeus, the royal cobra, to the owner's forehead and altering the wall scenes. It is possible that Horemheb wanted to be buried there, but religious and customary practices forbade it. Rather, he built a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, which was lavishly decorated but as dull as a king's tomb could be in ancient Egypt. Gods constantly greeted their new co-workers in the afterlife as they processed along the walls. After all, there may have been benefits associated with the number 2 slot. The problem is that there are very few year dates from Horemheb's rule. The highest known date is 13, found on a jar discovered in a Memphite tomb. An inscription from the year 16 published by researchers and mentions an unknown campaign that took place deep into Syria is considered fake. The 16-year estimate is tenable given Horemheb's probable age at his accession. However, the issue is complicated by a later text from Rameses II's reign, known as the Inscription of Mose. This explains a lengthy legal dispute spanning several generations over who owned a parcel of land. The narrator mentions things that happened before his time at one point, referring to Horemheb's year 59. Horemheb's score is extremely unlikely to have been so high, and historians agree that this number is a fabrication that lumps the years of Akhenaten and his short-lived successors together with the general's rule. It was a clever move to remove any mention of Atenism from the documents and give the man regarded as the forerunner of the new era a more remarkable term in office. The Mose reference suggests that Horemheb's true reign lasted at least 27 years, if this is the explanation. A reference to a year. The number 27 is found in a graffito from the king's mortuary temple, but it might be a record from a different reign. The time that Thoth of Hermopolis and Horus of Hansu allowed Horemheb to rule over Egypt is still being determined. This issue affects the order of events leading up to him, but it becomes less significant when you look at the soldier king's place in Egyptian history. Regarding Horemheb, some historians of this era have questioned if he was a reactionary or a reformer. This is a difficult question. Denying the distinction's validity is one way to sidestep this difficult question, but doing so can have unintended consequences. Living in the aftermath of Akhenaten's radical reforms was Horemheb. Reversing the course of events was the necessary remedy for the mishandled reform. Horemheb is reactive in this way, but it doesn't mean he has given up on the desire to see justice prevail in the world. An imagined age of innocence had been subverted by fanaticism, but Horemheb's knowledge of human frailty warned him against returning to such a state of affairs. Despite this contradiction, we can situate him at the progressive end of the conservative spectrum, highlighting the center-right's efficacy in accomplishing objectives. In the epilogue to his decree, Horemheb evaluates himself. Building monuments for the gods will be my life's work. I will always be rejuvenated, just like the moon. One whose appendages illuminated the far corners of the planet, akin to the sun god's disk. The Egyptians knew through monuments that the gods would have been pleased with justice, piety, stone structures, and reform. Horemheb did not find the moon simile strange, even though it may appear so to the modern mind. It reminds him of his position under several sun kings and alludes to the god Thoth, who governed his life. It also brings to mind a section from the Wisdom of Amenemopi, a text concerning ethics and philosophy written around the time of Horemheb. This passage portrays the moon as the eye of justice, peering at the wrongdoer even as he tries to hide in the shadows. This was Horemheb's choice for his legacy.